The pen pressed down deliberately across the resignation paper on April 30, 1937, at Maxwell Field in Alabama. Each deliberate stroke felt heavy with significance, the weight of 2 decades in uniform flowing through the ink. Captain Claire Leachman, the Chief of Pursuit Training for the United States Army Air Corps, was signing away his military career at 43 years old. Chronic bronchitis had destroyed his lungs from years of flying in open cockpits, the wind and elements taking their toll. Progressive deafness now made it difficult to communicate with students and fellow officers, making even routine conversations a struggle. Yet these physical problems were really just convenient excuses for an organization that desperately wanted to be rid of a troublemaker. The real story sat in the filing cabinets surrounding him. Memorandums argued passionately that fighter aircraft could intercept and destroy bomber formations. Tactical manuals detailed pursuit strategies that contradicted everything the bomber advocates believed. Training reports showed how well-executed fighter tactics could devastate enemy air forces. Every single one had been dismissed, ridiculed, ignored by superiors who clung to one unquestioned truth: the bomber would always get through. Nothing could stop it. As Leachman walked away from Maxwell Field that spring afternoon, his colleagues felt an unmistakable sense of relief wash over them. The radical was finally gone. The dissenter who refused to accept bomber supremacy had been forced out. They had no way of knowing that within 5 years, his forced retirement would become the greatest vindication in military aviation history. The tactics they had called obsolete would prove revolutionary. The theories they had dismissed would save an entire nation from conquest. And the officer they had fired would return as a general, commanding operations that would validate everything they had declared impossible. The roots of Leachman's unconventional thinking went back to the 1920s in Hawaii. Stationed at Ford Island between 1923 and 1926, as commander of the 19th Pursuit Squadron, he spent endless hours studying fighter tactics, while the rest of the air service remained fixated on bombardment theory. He flew mock combat missions, analyzed aerial maneuvers, documented every engagement with meticulous care. Inside his small base quarters, surrounded by technical manuals and tactical diagrams, he began developing ideas that would eventually transform air warfare entirely. The accepted wisdom seemed absolutely unshakable at the time. The Martin B-10 bomber, introduced in 1932, could fly at 215 miles per hour. The Boeing P-26 fighter managed 234 miles per hour, offering only a marginal speed advantage. Army Air Corps exercises appeared deliberately designed to prove bomber invincibility. During 1931 maneuvers in Ohio, pursuit squadrons failed to intercept a single bomber formation over 2 weeks of intensive operations. The commanding general reached what seemed like an inescapable conclusion. Due to increased speeds and limitless space, it is impossible for fighters to intercept bombers, and therefore it is inconsistent with the employment of Air Force to develop fighters. The doctrine became unquestioned gospel. The Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field stopped teaching fighter tactics entirely in 1936. All resources flowed exclusively toward bombardment development. The age of the invincible bomber had officially arrived. But Leachman refused to accept this conclusion. He had studied those Ohio exercises with intense forensic detail. The conditions had been manipulated. The rules favored bombers overwhelmingly. The pursuit squadrons received inadequate warning time, insufficient altitude, deliberately handicapped communication systems. When Leachman ran his own tactical experiments with the 19th Pursuit Squadron, using realistic combat conditions and proper coordination, his fighters intercepted bomber formations with devastating effectiveness every single time. His observations convinced him that bomber advocates were making fundamental errors. They presumed that pursuit aircraft would engage in individual dogfighting, the aerial jousting that had characterized World War I combat over the Western Front. Leachman saw this as medieval thinking applied to modern warfare. Fighters needed to operate in coordinated pairs and larger formations. They needed early warning systems to achieve advantageous positioning. They needed tactics that exploited their genuine strengths while avoiding vulnerable turning battles. In 1929, Leachman received promotion to captain. By 1931, he had graduated from the Air Corps Tactical School at Langley Field, Virginia. His instructors kept him on staff as a faculty member, teaching pursuit tactics. It should have been the beginning of a distinguished career. Instead, it marked the start of his isolation. At Langley and later at Maxwell Field, Leachman found himself swimming against an overwhelming current. The tactical school had become the intellectual center of bomber theory. Faculty members were developing doctrine that would define Air Corps thinking for the next decade. Strategic bombardment would cripple enemy industrial capacity. High-altitude precision bombing would devastate military production. Nothing could stop determined bomber formations. Leachman's opposing arguments earned him the nickname Radical Leachman among colleagues. He insisted loudly that well-trained pursuit squadrons, using proper tactics, could shatter bomber formations. His gruff personality and uncompromising nature made him few friends among the officer corps. When he published his textbook, The Role of Defensive Pursuit, in 1935, it should have established his reputation as a forward-thinking tactician. Instead, it marked him as someone unwilling to accept institutional wisdom. In June 1936, at Maxwell Field, Leachman received promotion to major. It would be his final promotion. By early 1937, his health problems provided convenient cover for an organization eager to remove him from power. When he signed those retirement papers on April 30, 1937, most Air Corps officers considered it good riddance. The tactical school could now teach bombardment theory without interference. The future belonged to the bomber, and the future had no place for Claire Leachman. Yet even as Leachman cleared out his Maxwell Field office, events on the other side of the Pacific were proving his theories correct. On July 7, 1937, near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Peking, China, Japanese and Chinese troops exchanged fire in an incident that would escalate into full-scale war within weeks. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun, and it would become the laboratory where Leachman's dismissed tactics would finally be tested under actual combat conditions. Leachman had arrived in China just weeks earlier, hired on a 3-month contract at $1,000 monthly to survey the Chinese Air Force for Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Song Mei-ling, known as Madame Chiang. What he discovered shocked him profoundly. The Chinese Air Force possessed obsolete aircraft, inadequately trained pilots, and no coherent tactical doctrine. When Japanese forces launched their invasion, Chinese air resistance collapsed almost instantly. Japan possessed overwhelming advantages. The Mitsubishi A-5M fighter dominated Chinese skies with superior speed, maneuverability, and experienced pilots trained in actual combat. Japanese bomber formations could raid Chinese cities with complete impunity. Within months, Japan controlled Chinese airspace across the eastern provinces entirely. But Leachman saw genuine opportunity hidden within this catastrophe. China desperately needed effective air defense. The nationalist government possessed resources to purchase aircraft and hire foreign pilots. Most importantly, Chinese leaders proved willing to listen to radical ideas, because conventional approaches had failed catastrophically. Over the next 3 years, Leachman worked to rebuild Chinese air power, while the Air Corps back in America remained obsessed with bombers. He trained Chinese pilots in his tactical theories. He established early warning networks, using ground observers equipped with radios to compensate for the lack of radar technology. He studied Japanese aircraft and tactics with meticulous attention, identifying vulnerabilities to exploit. By 1940, Leachman recognized that Chinese pilots alone could not stem the Japanese onslaught. He needed experienced combat aviators who understood his methods. He needed fighter aircraft capable of matching Japanese fighters. Most importantly, he needed official American support without pulling the United States into war before the nation was prepared. In October 1940, with Chiang Kai-shek's blessing, Leachman returned to America with an audacious proposal. President Franklin Roosevelt faced a delicate situation. American public opinion remained staunchly isolationist. Yet Roosevelt understood that Japanese expansion threatened American interests throughout Asia. Leachman's proposal offered an elegant solution: recruit American military pilots who would resign their commissions to become civilian volunteers. Purchase fighter aircraft from American manufacturers for transfer to the Chinese Air Force. The arrangement provided plausible deniability while allowing substantial American assistance to Chinese resistance. Recruiting pilots proved enormously difficult. Active duty military aviators earned stable salaries with clear career advancement. Leachman offered one-year contracts in a combat zone halfway around the world, fighting an experienced enemy with unfamiliar aircraft. The financial incentives needed to be substantial. Pilots would receive salaries ranging from $600 monthly for wingmen to $750 for squadron commanders. More importantly, they would receive $500 bonuses for every Japanese aircraft destroyed. For young aviators facing decades of peacetime military service, the opportunity to see actual combat while earning substantial money proved irresistible. 100 pilots eventually signed contracts. They came from Navy fighter squadrons, Marine Corps aviation units, and Army Air Corps pursuit groups. Many were skilled but difficult personalities, men whose aggressive tendencies made them poor fits for peacetime military discipline. They were exactly the type of pilots Leachman needed. The aircraft arrived first. 100 Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, purchased by the Chinese government from American production lines, originally intended for the Royal Air Force. The P-40 was already considered obsolete by American standards in 1941. American procurement officers focused on newer designs like the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-40 lacked the maneuverability of Japanese fighters, particularly the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. Its Allison V1710 engine produced 1,040 horsepower in the early B-model variants that arrived, significantly less than more advanced designs entering service. At high altitudes above 15,000 feet, where thin air reduced engine performance, the P-40's capabilities degraded substantially. Japanese fighters could outclimb and outturn it at almost any altitude. But Leachman understood something American procurement officers had completely missed. The P-40 possessed specific advantages that could prove decisive under proper tactical employment. Its airframe was rugged and heavily built, capable of sustaining battle damage that would destroy lighter Japanese aircraft. Pilots reported absorbing hits from 20mm cannon shells and 50 caliber rounds that would have torn apart a Zero, yet still bringing their P-40s home safely. The aircraft's armored cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks, features Japanese designers had sacrificed for performance and range, saved American lives repeatedly. It carried 6 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, with heavy ammunition loads exceeding 200 rounds per gun. This represented devastating firepower by early World War II standards. A single P-40 could deliver more weight of fire than most enemy fighters. When multiple P-40s concentrated their fire on a single target, as Leachman's tactics demanded, the results were catastrophic for whatever aircraft found itself in the cone of fire. Japanese bombers, unarmored and carrying volatile fuel and munitions, typically disintegrated under sustained 50 caliber fire. Most importantly for Leachman's tactics, the P-40 could achieve tremendous speed in diving attacks. The robust airframe and relatively heavy weight that made it sluggish in climbs and turns became genuine advantages in dives. Pilots reported achieving speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour in steep dives, far exceeding what Japanese fighters could match without risking structural failure. This speed differential was the key to Leachman's entire tactical system. Attack from above, dive through the target at speeds the enemy cannot match, extend away before the enemy can respond, climb back to altitude outside their range, repeat the process. The P-40 was purpose-built for this style of warfare, even if its designers had not recognized it. The pilots began arriving in Burma during the summer of 1941. They came in small groups, traveling secretive routes on civilian transport ships, carrying forged paperwork, identifying them as teachers, missionaries, and businessmen. The journey itself was arduous and exhausting. Men accustomed to military discipline found themselves traveling as civilians through the Panama Canal across the Pacific to Southeast Asia. Some took months to reach their destination. They arrived at Toungoo Airfield in central Burma to conditions far removed from comfortable American air bases. The airfield sat in jungle territory, surrounded by oppressive heat and fierce mosquitoes. Living quarters consisted of grass huts with minimal amenities. Food was often marginal, medical facilities were primitive. Many pilots suffered from dysentery, malaria, and heat exhaustion within weeks of arrival. Yet Leachman pushed them through the most intensive training program any American pilots had yet experienced. He drilled one set of tactics relentlessly, never engaged Japanese fighters in turning combat. The Zero and Oscar possessed superior maneuverability. Any attempt at classic dogfighting would be suicide. Always maintain altitude advantage before attacking. Leachman emphasized that fights were won before the first shot was fired through proper positioning. Fight in pairs with mutual support. The wingman system Leachman developed would eventually become standard throughout American fighter aviation. Use diving attacks to exploit the P-40's superior speed and firepower. The Warhawk could achieve speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour in steep dives, far beyond what Japanese fighters could match. Make slashing runs through enemy formations, then use diving speed to disengage before Japanese fighters could respond. Never linger, never turn back for a second pass from the same angle. Climb back to altitude outside enemy range and repeat from a different vector. The tactics contradicted everything most pilots had learned in military flight training. Conventional pursuit doctrine emphasized dogfighting, individual aerial combat showcasing pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability. Leachman's approach seemed cowardly to some pilots raised on romanticized notions of aerial chivalry. They wanted to engage in turning battles to prove their superiority through direct competition. Leachman would have none of it. This is not sport, he told them repeatedly. This is killing. He showed them gun camera footage from Chinese pilots who had engaged Japanese fighters conventionally. The results were invariably the same. The Chinese aircraft, attempting to turn with more maneuverable opponents, would lose energy and altitude. Within seconds, a Japanese fighter would be on their tail. The Chinese pilot slumped in his seat moments later, dead. Shenu demanded his aviators watch these gruesome films over and over, letting the images sink deep into their minds. The message was unmistakable. Fly my way or perish like that pilot did. Yet Shenu's vision stretched far beyond simply keeping his men alive in the cockpit. He was molding them into lethal hunters, training them to eliminate Japanese pilots and shred their aircraft with methodical precision. His approach leveraged everything the P-40 could do while systematically stripping away every Japanese advantage. The Zero's legendary agility counted for nothing if it never closed within striking distance. The Japanese pilots' years of combat experience became meaningless if the attack arrived without warning. These tactics represented 15 years of development that Shenu had pursued while the Air Force establishment turned its back on him. Out here in the Burmese jungle, removed from headquarters politics that had forced his retirement, he would finally demonstrate they could work. Shenu also constructed an early warning network that would prove equally crucial to his pilot training. Through radio equipment and local Chinese volunteers, he built a detection system spanning hundreds of miles across the landscape. Spotters positioned in caves and mountain outposts would listen for aircraft sounds, judge how many planes approached and from which direction, then broadcast this intelligence to headquarters. Shenu's fighters received precious minutes to gain altitude and positioning advantage before Japanese formations arrived overhead. Though primitive compared to modern radar technology, this system represented revolutionary capability given China's technological constraints. By December 1941, the American volunteers had split into 3 separate squadrons. The 1st Pursuit Squadron, commanded by squadron leader Robert Neal, operated as one unit. The 2nd Pursuit Squadron, under squadron leader Jack Newcook, formed the 2nd group. The 3rd Pursuit Squadron, headed by squadron leader Arvid Olsen, completed the structure. Between them, they had roughly 82 trained pilots and approximately 62 combat-ready P-40 fighters spread across bases near Kunming in southern China and Rangoon in Burma. They remained unnamed as yet. That designation would arrive later. These pilots simply called themselves the Average. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor experienced devastation that day. The Japanese surprise strike obliterated the American Pacific Fleet and claimed over 2,000 American servicemen. Across the vast Pacific, Japanese forces struck simultaneously at American, British, and Dutch targets. The Japanese military machine advanced with ruthless efficiency, sweeping everything before it. American confidence collapsed to depths unseen since the Civil War. The nation needed victories desperately. Any sign that America could strike back would restore flagging spirits. December 20th, 1941. Kunming came under attack. Shenu's early warning network sprang into action that morning, detecting Japanese bomber formations pushing toward the city from Indochina. 10 Mitsubishi Ki-21 bombers and 21 Sally bombers had departed from Hanoi airfield expecting an ordinary bombing run. For months they had pounded Kunming without meeting resistance. The Japanese crews anticipated another unopposed raid over the city, but Shenu's network was ready. Ground observers stationed in caves surrounding Kunming picked up the distant rumble of aircraft engines while the bombers remained miles away. Radio operators transmitted urgent warnings to average headquarters. By the time the formations neared the city, 18 P-40 Warhawks were climbing toward intercept altitude under Shenu's radio guidance from the ground. The Hells Angels squadron struck first. P-40s dove through the formation at speeds the Japanese fighters couldn't match, tearing into bombers before escort pilots could respond effectively. The Americans climbed away, regrouped, and attacked again from another angle. 4 Japanese bombers exploded in flames. 3 others sustained damage that crippled their ability to fight. The remaining bombers dropped their loads hastily and fled toward home. Kunming citizens watched in astonishment as Japanese planes fell burning from the sky. This was the first time they'd witnessed such a sight during the entire war. Shenu met the P-40 pilots on the runway as they returned. His weathered face remained impassive as pilots climbed from their cockpits. Adequate performance, he told them flatly, but unacceptable incompleteness. Destroy every single aircraft next time. Those words captured Shenu's absolute demand for perfection. 4 confirmed kills represented genuine achievement, yet 6 bombers had escaped. 3 days passed before the Japanese returned with overwhelming strength. 63 bombers escorted by 25 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters approached Rangoon. The Japanese had learned from their previous defeat. Reports of the mysterious fighters that ravaged the Kunming raid prompted them to bring crushing numerical superiority. 14 average P-40s rose to intercept, joined by 15 Royal Air Force Brewster Buffalo fighters. The defenders faced nearly 3-to-1 odds. Normal military logic predicted the Japanese would crush the outnumbered Allied fighters through sheer force of numbers. But the battle developing above Rangoon would stretch over an hour, becoming the first serious test of Shenu's tactical system against a determined, experienced opponent. Average pilots executed his approach with textbook precision that would have impressed their commander immensely. Robert Neal led the Adam and Eve squadron into the initial assault. His fighters had climbed to altitude, while Japanese formations still approached, utilizing the early warning system to achieve perfect positioning. When Neal signaled the attack, his squadron plummeted through the bomber formation from 12,000 feet, achieving speeds that made pursuit impossible. P-40 50 caliber machine guns concentrated murderous firepower on unarmored bombers. Each P-40's weapons delivered more than 300 rounds every minute, more than 40 pounds of lead and steel each 60 seconds. Japanese bombers built for distance and cargo capacity rather than protective armor couldn't absorb such punishment. The initial pass saw 3 bombers tumbling toward Earth in flames. The P-40s didn't linger in the formation. Following Shenu's doctrine precisely, they dove completely through the bomber stream, using their velocity to create distance from escort fighters. They climbed back to altitude outside enemy engagement range. Oscar pilots attempting to defend their bombers discovered they couldn't catch the diving P-40s. Whenever they tried to chase, the Americans simply accelerated away. When Oscar pilots attempted climbing back to the bomber stream, the P-40s had already repositioned for their next pass. This represented fighter combat as mathematical precision, not romantic aerial artistry. Shenu had designed these tactics so his pilots would maintain every advantage. The Japanese flew superior fighters with more experienced crews. Shenu made these strengths irrelevant by refusing to engage in combat types where they mattered. His pilots fought at altitudes and speeds where P-40 performance excelled. They transformed aerial warfare into an engineering challenge rather than a test of individual flying mastery. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force Buffaloes fought using traditional tactics. British pilots trained in conventional doctrine that celebrated individual skill, and turning contests entered dogfights with Japanese escorts. The outcomes proved predictable and terrible. Brewster Buffaloes, already outdated when manufactured, lacked turning performance to compete with Oscars. Japanese pilots carrying years of actual combat experience systematically picked apart the British fighters. The contrast between the average's accomplishments and RAF losses provided undeniable proof of Chenu's tactical brilliance. When Japanese formations withdrew, they had lost over 30 aircraft destroyed or damaged severely. Exact numbers remained unclear in battle confusion, but the defeat seemed total. The 63rd Sentai, an elite Japanese bomber group, ceased functioning as an effective fighting force. The Japanese had squandered aircraft, lost veteran crews, and most critically, discovered they weren't invincible. The average lost 3 P-40s in combat and 2 more destroyed on the ground during enemy bombardment. British Buffaloes suffered devastating casualties. When comparing American and British losses while fighting identical opponents using different tactical approaches, the difference couldn't have been more dramatic. American newspapers received the Christmas Day air battle story within days. Editors hunting for encouraging news discovered exactly what they needed in this colorful volunteer group. Life magazine dispatched photographers, Time magazine sent reporters. Henry Luce, the prominent publisher with established China connections, provided extensive coverage featuring Chenu and his pilots. Someone at Time magazine created the name Flying Tigers. Disney Studios designed a logo. The pilots had already added shark-mouth nose art to their aircraft, drawing inspiration from Royal Air Force P-40s operating in North Africa. This combination of striking name and visual imagery generated immediate recognition. Claire Chenu emerged as America's first military celebrity of World War II. Newspapers celebrated the leather-faced commander rejected by the Air Force, but now leading American aviators to triumph. Chenu appreciated the irony. The Air Force had written him off 5 years earlier as a troublemaker pushing obsolete theories. Now those same concepts were generating the only positive headlines in a war dominated by American setbacks. During the months that followed, the Flying Tigers established a combat reputation that endures today. Operating from bases scattered across Burma and southern China, the 3 squadrons flew against Japanese forces, outnumbering them 20-1. They never possessed more than 50 combat-ready aircraft simultaneously. Pilot shortages forced them to fly multiple sorties every single day, accumulating exhaustion that would normally ground them. Spare parts became chronically scarce, forcing ground crews to strip damaged planes to maintain others. Ammunition supplies frequently ran short. Fuel required dangerous flights over mountainous terrain originating from India. The supply crisis intensified as Japanese forces pushed forward. Rangoon's fall in March 1942 eliminated their most accessible supply route. Supplies now traveled through Kunming, arrived via perilous Himalayan flights, or came by truck along the treacherous Burma Road before Japanese forces severed that line. The average operated on threadbare margins, perpetually one disaster away from collapse. Yet Chenu's training philosophy produced results that seemed to defy mathematical probability and logistical nightmares. His pilots maximized every round, treated every mission as critical. They flew with surgical precision born from scarcity, knowing that careless ammunition use or aircraft damage could spell disaster. The early warning system granted them the ability to select engagements strategically, attacking when conditions favored them, refusing combat when circumstances didn't align. This represented tactical wisdom rather than cowardice, Chenu emphasized. It meant deploying scarce resources intelligently. The tactical victories appeared consistently throughout spring 1942. In January, over Rangoon, 6 P-40s encountered a mixed bomber and fighter formation, shooting down 4 aircraft without casualties. In March, Flying Tigers defended the critical Salween River Gorge, where Chinese forces had destroyed the bridge to impede Japanese advancement. For 4 consecutive days, average pilots flew without stopping, destroying enemy transport vehicles and preventing bridge reconstruction, buying time for Chinese ground units to create defensive positions. In May, they covered the British withdrawal from Burma, providing air protection that preserved thousands of lives. By July 4, 1942, when the average officially disbanded, official records credited the unit with destroying 296 Japanese aircraft. Contemporary historical analysis indicates this figure, like most wartime aerial claims, probably reflected overcounting common across all nations during high-speed combat without precise verification systems. Even accounting for exaggeration, the Flying Tiger's actual achievements remained genuinely remarkable. The unit suffered 14 pilots killed in action and 9 more in accidents. Their credited kill-to-loss ratio surpassed 20-1, surpassing any other American unit during the war's opening phase. Individual pilots became aces who earned lasting places in aviation history. Robert Neal, leading the 1st Pursuit Squadron, destroyed 16 Japanese aircraft and became the average's top ace. His combat leadership matched his tactical expertise. Pilots serving under him described a commander who stayed composed under intense fire, made rapid decisions based on Chenu's principles, and returned his pilots home safely. Neal's achievements validated Chenu's unconventional leadership selection process, emphasizing judgment and tactical understanding rather than rank seniority. David Lee Hill, the Texan who took over the 2nd Pursuit Squadron, destroyed more than 12 enemy aircraft and elected to remain active after the average disbanded. Hill joined the regular Army Air Forces when the volunteer group ended, bringing continuity and institutional memory to the 23rd Fighter Group that succeeded the average. His later memoir became one of aviation history's most authoritative first-person accounts of Flying Tiger combat. Charles Older, Robert Prescott, and George Burgard each accumulated double-digit victory counts, entering an exclusive circle of American aces who reached that status during the war's terrifying opening months when Japanese forces appeared unstoppable everywhere. These pilots demonstrated that correctly trained aviators executing sound tactics could overcome numerical disadvantage and fearsome enemy reputations. Their accomplishments stemmed not from individual genius, though they certainly flew skillfully. Their success resulted from methodical application of Chenu's tactical concepts despite facing overwhelming opposition. Even ordinary pilots achieved extraordinary results using Chenu's approach. Men who might have become adequate but unremarkable pilots using traditional tactics became devastatingly effective executing the strike and withdraw methods Chenu demanded. His tactics evened competition, permitting moderately skilled pilots to survive and triumph against more seasoned opponents. This transformation of fighter effectiveness became one of Chenu's most enduring contributions. Superior tactics applied consistently could transform average pilots into formidable combatants and elite pilots into practically unbeatable ones. Japanese forces developed a healthy respect for the shark-mouthed P-40s. Following the initial Kunming engagement, Japanese bombers never again attempted attacking the city, while Flying Tigers provided defense. Chenu had accomplished something unprecedented in air warfare. He had conceived tactics deliberately crafted to eliminate enemy strengths while emphasizing friendly capabilities. The Japanese enjoyed superior fighter performance and more experienced pilots. Chenu rendered these advantages meaningless by declining to engage in the type of combat where they mattered. His pilots battled at altitudes and speeds, maximizing P-40 advantages. They converted aerial combat into an engineering problem instead of a test of flying artistry. Military recognition followed tactical accomplishment. On April 15, 1942, while the average continued fighting, the United States Army Air Force recalled Chenu to active service as a colonel. 8 days afterward, on April 23, promotion to brigadier general followed. The advancement moved at extraordinary speed. Chenu had jumped from retired major to brigadier general in merely 14 days. His promotion reflected the Air Force's belated recognition of a hard truth. Chenu had been correct all along. In July 1942, the average officially disbanded and merged into the United States Army Air Forces as the 23rd Fighter Group within the recently created China Air Task Force. Most average pilots chose different paths, yet Chenu remained committed. He commanded active military squadrons while developing fresh pilots arriving from America. In March 1943, Chenu earned promotion to Major General and assumed control of the 14th Air Force, overseeing all American aerial operations across China. At 49 years old, merely 6 years following his forced retirement, he commanded roughly 700 aircraft at maximum capacity. Despite representing the smallest American Air Force in any combat region, constrained by severe logistics challenges moving supplies over the hump from India, the 14th Air Force performed far beyond expectations. The supply challenges remained critical. Every drop of fuel, every round of ammunition, every replacement component had to be transported by air from India, crossing over the towering Himalayan peaks in vulnerable cargo planes. The aircraft battled through savage weather, relied on primitive navigation systems, and faced constant threat from Japanese fighters. Pilots gave it a name that stuck, Flying the Hump, and the statistics told the grim story. It ranked among the deadliest flying duty in the entire war. Hundreds of aircraft simply disappeared into the mountains or fell to enemy guns, their crews lost forever. The volume of supplies actually reaching China fell far short of what was desperately needed. Operating under these constraints would have been dismissed as impossible by any other theater commander. Yet he found a way to make it work, combining brilliant tactical thinking with ruthless operational discipline. The 14th Air Force pursued targets that delivered maximum impact for minimum resource investment. They struck at Japanese merchant vessels plying coastal routes and rivers. They attacked supply warehouses and logistics installations. They bombed airfields and destroyed Japanese aircraft sitting on the ground. He rejected the massive strategic bombing campaigns that consumed enormous resources while producing questionable results. Instead, he waged focused tactical operations that directly assisted Chinese ground forces and systematically degraded Japanese ability to operate. The numbers revealed the success. Official Air Force records credited the 14th with destroying more than 2,300 Japanese aircraft before the war's conclusion. They sent dozens of Japanese vessels to the bottom, obliterated hundreds of locomotives and thousands of trucks, annihilated countless ammunition and supply depots. They achieved all this using a force that never exceeded 700 aircraft and frequently operated with considerably fewer due to maintenance needs and combat damage. His units functioned under conditions that advocates of strategic bombing would have declared totally impractical. The innovative methods he developed in China would become the operational foundation for future military campaigns. His focus on tactical aviation, directly supporting infantry movements, anticipated the close air support doctrine that would define warfare for generations to come. His obsession with maximum results from minimal resources foreshadowed the efficiency demands that would shape air operations in Korea, Vietnam, and conflicts beyond. His rejection of inflexible doctrine in favor of adaptive, flexible tactics influenced air warfare strategy for decades to come. A dismissed major who'd been labeled obsolete was literally constructing the future of air power. The metamorphosis was complete. The officer people had called a troublemaker achieved the rank of Major General. The visionary they'd forced to leave the service now commanded one of America's most triumphant air forces. The man they'd removed for opposing the doctrine of bomber supremacy now led an organization achieving stunning success. Every prediction he'd made, every tactical principle he'd advocated, every disagreement he'd voiced during those painful years of institutional resistance had been confirmed through actual combat. The contradiction permeated the entire Air Force and became impossible to escape. The bomber doctrine that had dominated American air power planning throughout the 1930s turned out to be catastrophically mistaken when tested in real warfare. Unescorted bombers, penetrating deep into enemy-controlled airspace, suffered devastating casualties across both the European and Pacific operations. The fundamental belief that bombers could always penetrate defenses collapsed when confronted with organized fighter opposition. The 8th Air Force bombing campaign against Germany provided undeniable proof. During August 1943 raids targeting the Schweinfurt ball-bearing facilities and Regensburg aircraft plants, the 8th Air Force dispatched 376 bombers and lost 60 in that single operation. That represented a catastrophic 16% loss rate in just one day. When they returned to Schweinfurt in October 1943, they lost another 60 bombers in an equally catastrophic blow. Crews flying unescorted bombers across Germany faced mathematical certainty of death or capture before they could complete their required 25 mission tours. The bloodletting became impossible to sustain. The entire bombing strategy threatened to disintegrate. Salvation arrived from an aircraft type the Air Force had almost discarded. Long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, possessed the range to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and return home. These fighters fundamentally transformed the bombing campaign. German fighters that had slaughtered unescorted bomber formations suddenly found themselves engaged by American fighters, matching their performance and overwhelming them through sheer numerical production capacity. The bombing offensive succeeded not because bombers were invulnerable, but because fighters shielded them from attack. Everything he had argued during the 1930s achieved bloody confirmation in the skies over Germany. The fighters he had championed, while others dismissed him, became the essential element for establishing air superiority across every theater. In Europe, fighter sweeps cleared German aircraft from the sky. In the Pacific, fighter protection made island-hopping campaigns possible. In China, a tiny force of fighters accomplished results completely disproportionate to their numbers. Fighter aviation, which the Air Force had nearly eliminated from strategic thinking during the 1930s, emerged as the foundation of American air power and remained so throughout the remainder of the 20th century. He observed these vindications with satisfaction, but without surprise. He'd tried desperately to warn his superiors about what was coming. He'd pointed out that bomber invulnerability was an illusion. He'd insisted that fighters represented a necessity for both offense and defense. They branded him obsolete and forced him out. Combat ultimately verified every argument he'd made. His vindication came with costs. Throughout the war, he endured constant conflict with General Joseph Stilwell, the senior American commander overseeing Chinese operations. Their fundamental disagreements regarding military strategy and how resources should be distributed became increasingly acrimonious. He repeatedly bypassed official channels, communicating directly with Chiang Kai-shek and President Roosevelt. Stillwell wanted resources channeled toward organizing and arming Chinese ground forces for an offensive to re-establish land supply corridors through northern Burma. He contended that air power, adequately supplied, could accomplish far more with far less commitment. The conflict turned intensely personal, with Stillwell viewing him as insubordinate and egotistical, while he considered Stillwell inflexible and trapped by conventional military thinking. This conduct created powerful enemies among senior Air Force leadership, particularly General Henry Arnold, who directed the entire Army Air Forces and had no tolerance for theater commanders who sidestepped proper channels. The conflict reached critical levels in 1944 when Arnold, frustrated by his repeated end runs around Stillwell, started questioning whether he should remain commanding the 14th Air Force. He survived this challenge partly because of his demonstrated success and partly because of influential connections to Washington and the Chinese government, though the cost to his relationships with senior Air Force leadership proved permanent. When the war concluded in August 1945, he retired again, leaving behind an impressive combat record, but having damaged important relationships with influential colleagues in Air Force circles. He had been proven absolutely right on strategy and tactics, yet his unconventional methods of achieving recognition had alienated the institutional support network that could have propelled him toward higher peacetime commands. On October 8, 1945, he departed the military for the second and last time. He didn't disappear into anonymous civilian life. In 1946, he went back to China and created civil air transport, establishing an airline that would become instrumental in the Chinese Civil War and subsequently conduct classified operations throughout Asia. The airline delivered supplies to nationalist forces battling communist insurgents, provided disaster relief assistance, and executed missions spanning legitimate commercial aviation to intelligence gathering. Following communist victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the airline relocated to Taiwan and continued its operations across the Asian region. Eventually, the CIA purchased the airline, incorporating it into what became famous as Air America, operating in contentious capacities throughout Southeast Asian conflicts into the 1970s. On July 18, 1958, just before succumbing to lung cancer at 64 years old, the Air Force granted him the honorary rank of Lieutenant General. The recognition arrived too late for him to fully appreciate it. He passed away 9 days later on July 27, 1958, in New Orleans, Louisiana. Arlington National Cemetery received his remains, buried with complete military honors, the troublemaker eventually receiving recognition that had been withheld throughout his career. Yet his authentic legacy transcended rank or ceremonial acknowledgement. It existed in training manuals that adopted his methods wholesale. It endured in fighter squadrons that flew his techniques throughout the war and for decades afterward. It manifested in thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed by pilots trained in tactics descending directly from what he had developed in China's jungles and skies. The tactical principles he pioneered became the bedrock of American fighter doctrine and remained so through the jet age and into the missile era. His emphasis on altitude superiority before engagement became standard instruction taught to every fighter pilot from World War II through Vietnam and beyond. His doctrine of coordinated tactics and mutual support between wingmen formed the foundation of two-ship and four-ship formations that structured fighter operations for the remainder of the 20th century. His insistence on refusing disadvantageous combat and capitalizing on aircraft capabilities while minimizing weaknesses became the intellectual backbone of how fighter tactics evolved. When the Air Force created its official fighter manuals in the decades following the war, they were fundamentally encoding his ideas. The influence extended far beyond specific tactics into broader strategy. His emphasis on tactical aviation, directly supporting ground operations, became the blueprint for close air support doctrine. His conviction that maximum results could be achieved from minimum resources anticipated the efficiency imperatives that would govern air operations in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. His assertion that properly equipped and adequately supplied air power could prove decisive continues influencing air power debates today. The arguments he advanced during the 1930s regarding fighter superiority and bomber vulnerability shaped how military strategists approached air warfare for generations. His emphasis on early warning systems and integrated air defense, rudimentary compared to later technological sophistication, established foundational principles underlying Cold War air defense structure. The concept of using ground observers and radio communication to direct fighters toward interception targets evolved into the radar-guided interception systems protecting American airspace for decades. What he'd assembled using radios and Chinese observers in 1941 became, in increasingly refined form, the semi-automatic ground environment system and the continent-wide radar network defending North America throughout the Cold War. The training methods he instituted, emphasizing realistic combat scenarios deliberately designed to highlight friendly advantages against enemy weaknesses, became templates for fighter weapons schools and tactical training across the services. The Navy's Top Gun School, established in 1969 following unacceptable Pacific losses, drew directly from principles he had established. The Air Force's Red Flag exercises, constructing realistic combat situations to prepare pilots before actual conflict, reflected his emphasis on rigorous training, producing battlefield effectiveness. Generations of fighter pilots subsequently employed methods he had pioneered. The Flying Tigers engaged in combat operations for merely 7 months, from December 1941 through July 1942. These 7 months permanently altered how aerial warfare functioned and established principles remaining relevant decades later. They demonstrated that fighter tactics could achieve revolutionary results when liberation from conventional doctrine. They proved that a modest force employing superior technique and thorough preparation could overcome significantly larger opponents possessing technical superiority. They showed that the officer the Air Force had rejected as outdated possessed comprehension of aerial combat, exceeding every senior leader who had forced his departure. The broader significance transcended specific tactics, reaching into organizational culture and military innovation. The narrative revealed how established institutions, particularly military hierarchies in peacetime, naturally resist innovation threatening accepted doctrine. The Air Force of the 1930s had invested enormous intellectual resources and substantial financial capital into bomber theory. Acknowledging that fighters possessed equal or greater importance would have demanded admitting that strategic judgments underlying years of planning and billions in purchases had been fundamentally mistaken. Institutions resist such admissions. Removing the critic proved simpler than reconsidering the doctrine. His eventual vindication demonstrated that institutional agreement, regardless of how universal, fails to constitute truth. Nearly every leader in the Air Force during the 1930s, with only exceptional few exceptions, accepted bomber doctrine as correct. They erred. He, marginalized and mocked, possessed accuracy. Combat, the ultimate judge of military thinking, established this beyond reasonable question. This realization echoes beyond aviation, beyond the military realm, to every domain where conventional wisdom resists challenges from unconventional perspectives. The narrative also underscores the necessity of testing ideas under genuine conditions. His reservations regarding bomber invincibility stemmed from his observation of rigged exercises that manipulated circumstances to achieve predetermined conclusions. His realistic exercises repeatedly showed fighters intercepting bombers. Air Force Command preferred exercises supporting their theories rather than genuine experiments that might dispute them. This psychological bias toward information confirming pre-existing beliefs while discounting contradicting evidence nearly damaged America grievously during World War II. The casualties among bomber crews across Germany quantified the institutional expense. Thousands of American aviators perished on missions officials had assured them required no fighter protection. Those deaths were avoidable if his warnings had achieved serious consideration in the 1930s, if the Air Force had started developing long-range escort fighters sooner, if bomber strategy had incorporated realistic assessment of fighter opposition, American casualties could have been substantially less severe. Institutional resistance to uncomfortable facts carries consequences measured in human lives. This narrative resonates because it captures something universally true regarding innovation and resistance to change. He was right. The Air Force establishment was incorrect, yet institutions rarely acknowledge error until evidence becomes absolutely undeniable. His forced retirement demonstrated the organizational preference for silencing dissent, rather than engaging problematic ideas. His subsequent achievements proved that suppressing critics fails to invalidate their arguments. When Captain Claire Chennault put his signature to those retirement papers at Maxwell Field in April 1937, he walked away from 2 decades of service, possessing nothing but rejection and disappointment. When Major General Claire Chennault stepped down from commanding the 14th Air Force in August 1945, he departed having created a tactical inheritance influencing air power strategy across generations. The supposedly obsolete tactics had proven genuinely revolutionary. The officer forced to resign had been thoroughly vindicated. The Flying Tigers had composed one of history's memorable military chapters, establishing that occasionally the people labeled problems are correct and the institution is mistaken. The Flying Tigers have become among the most familiar military units in historical memory, their reputation extending beyond military contexts to saturate popular culture. The distinctive shark-mouth nose art appears on aircraft internationally, appropriated by military squadrons and private aviators alike as representation of combat determination. Aviation museums feature meticulously restored P-40 Warhawks displaying original Flying Tiger markings, each aircraft representing a memorial to his legacy. The Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum includes Flying Tiger aircraft among its most treasured possessions. Enthusiasts reconstruct P-40s to operational status, maintaining them as working history and demonstrating them at aviation gatherings where spectators experience these combat legends of yesteryear. The deeper significance, though, resides in the tactical transformation he achieved and its persistent influence on fighter operations worldwide. He fundamentally revolutionized fighter employment, transforming them from solitary aerial competitors into coordinated components of integrated combat operations. He definitively demonstrated that superior tactics could overcome numerical and equipment disadvantages. a principle retaining profound relevance today amid competition with adversaries potentially possessing numerical or technological advantages in specific areas. He exhibited that challenging institutional consensus, regardless of personal consequences, sometimes constitutes essential necessity for military strength and national protection. Recognition eventually materialized, though much arrived posthumously. The National Aviation Hall of Fame inducted him in 1972, positioning him among aviation history's greatest figures. The Postal Service issued commemorative postage in 1990, honoring his contributions. Streets and public buildings carry his name in Louisiana, his adopted residence, and throughout Taiwan, where the Republic of China acknowledges him as protector during their critical struggle. Kunming, China, the location where he directed American pilots into their initial combat missions, opened the Flying Tigers Museum in 2012, featuring exhibits documenting his essential contributions to Chinese perseverance and eventual triumph. Adversaries transformed into admirers, united by appreciation for what he and his aviators accomplished. The pilots serving under his direction maintained lifelong respect for their unconventional commander and the knowledge he imparted. Flying Tiger veterans gatherings persisted for years afterward, assembling retired pilots reminiscing about their youth and military service. They discussed him with reverence approaching worship, recalling a leader who possessed accuracy when everyone surrounding him was mistaken, who protected them with tactics producing results, who fashioned them into the most accomplished fighter unit during the war's earliest stages. These individuals, having endured America's most perilous epoch, comprehended his contributions. He furnished them weapons to persevere and triumph against impossible circumstances. Numerous veterans attributed their survival to his tactics, contradicting everything they previously assumed regarding fighter combat. His work, The Role of Defensive Pursuit, released in 1935 when the Air Force dismissed his concepts as antiquated thinking, became required study for fighter pilots within a decade of its appearance. The publication, generating no advancement during peace, became the foundational reference when actual warfare confirmed its principles. Flight schools throughout the service distributed copies. Training manuals incorporated its guidance. The overlooked manuscript became the essential text after combat substantiated its validity. The tactical approaches he established, elementary compared with subsequent technological advancement, anticipated the coordinated air defense frameworks dominating Cold War strategy. He had shown that early warning plus organized interception produces effective defense. This perception, validated using basic radios and observers in China, eventually became the foundation for the North American Air Defense Command and the radar network encircling the continent throughout the Cold War. The semi-automatic ground environment system, directing interceptors against Soviet bombers, originated conceptually from what he constructed with Chinese volunteers in mountain caves, listening for Japanese airplane engines. Every component of his methodology that received dismissal as outdated became foundational to contemporary warfare and extended influence across domains beyond aviation. His focus on maximizing friendly advantages while negating enemy strengths became basic military principle across all combat domains. His emphasis on demanding training and authentic assessment became how contemporary militaries prepare personnel for warfare. His demonstration that limited, well-trained, appropriately equipped forces employing correct tactics can overcome larger conventional adversaries, presaged contemporary special operations thinking, and the military revolutions characterizing the final 20th century. The retirement that seemed terminal in 1937 launched the opening of his most significant accomplishments and created possibilities military service might never have granted. His narrative provides continuing relevance for present military specialists, organizational administrators, and persons functioning within big institutions resisting transformation. How numerous unconventional innovators have institutions ejected due to opposing established doctrine. How numerous valuable innovations have institutions suppressed because contradicting prevailing consensus endangered careers. How numerous possibilities for progress have institutions abandoned because questioning accepted methods proved professionally dangerous. His success suggests these considerations warrant serious reflection throughout any organization, claiming commitment to innovation and adaptability. His overlooked theories had become revolutionary doctrine. The forced retiree had achieved complete vindication, and the Flying Tigers had demonstrated that dedicated commitment to accurate thinking could overcome institutional opposition and reshape history.